All right, so chapter 33 is on animal nutrition. So we'll talk about feeding categories and nutrients and food processing, the difference between a gastrovascular cavity or an alimentary canal, mechanical and chemical digestion, the path of food through the alimentary canal, the accessory digestive organs, and regulation of digestion. So we've talked about this before, but animals are heterotrophs, meaning they have to consume their food. We can contrast this with plants, which are autotrophs, meaning they make their own organic nutrients. And three kind of broad dietary categories for animals include herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. And you really need to focus on the bulk of the diet here. So herbivores eat only plants. They're highly adapted for chewing. Carnivores consume animal flesh or fluids, and they can be divided into predators and scavengers. They generally don't chew their food much. They take big bites and gulp and swallow them down. And then omnivores have teeth that are designed to eat both plant and animal material. As far as obtaining food goes, different animals obtain their food differently. Suspension feeders are kind of like filter feeders. They filter out organic matter out of water. This includes like a bivalve mollusk, so like a clam, a sea squirt, or a baleen whale. Then bulk feeding, those organisms eat large pieces of food. And then fluid feeders, just like what it sounds like, they either lick or suck fluid from plants or animals. And they don't have to have teeth typically, although some of them have teeth to puncture an animal's skin. And fluid feeding has actually evolved independently in many different animal types. So let's match the pictured animals and say whether they're an herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore, and whether they're a suspension feeder, bulk feeder, or fluid feeder. So I think the lion is a pretty easy one. If you didn't know what lions eat, it's in the picture. So the lion there is a carnivore, and it is a bulk feeder. Let's move to the horse. So what's a horse eat? Right? So they are herbivores. And then I always say this, how much hay does it take to run a horse? A lot. In an ag class, you'd probably get a different answer, but in my class, we're going to go with a lot. So horses are bulk feeders. And then down in the bottom left corner, we have a baleen whale. And I put a little note that it eats small crustaceans. So the baleen whale is actually, what's a crustacean? Do you remember crustaceans are... they're a type of arthropods, so they have exoskeletons. I mean, you're probably going to think of like a crab or a lobster as a crustacean, but they can be quite small as well. So this baleen whale is actually a carnivore, and it is a suspension feeder. And then the blood-sucking leech, I think that one's pretty obvious. It is a carnivore, and it is a fluid feeder. So animals need to get chemical energy, organic building blocks, and essential nutrients from their diet. So their chemical energy is ultimately used to make ATP to power cellular processes. Your organic building blocks are like carbon and nitrogen, which helps them build all of their different organic molecules. And then, an essential nutrient is required by cells and has to be obtained from dietary sources. The animal can't create them themselves from building blocks. So essential nutrients have to be obtained from the diet, and there's 4 types of essential nutrients. You can have essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals. Essential amino acids have to be obtained from food. The animal can't assemble them themselves. So animals have 20 amino acids that they need in order to stay alive. And, it depends on the animal what they can exactly synthesize, but most of them can synthesize about half from their diet. Fatty acids then are going to be converted into a variety of cellular components. I think fat gets a bad rap, but like all of your cell membrane phospholipids, remember it's a phospholipid bilayer, that's from fatty acids, different signaling molecules like steroids, and then obviously storage fats for energy storage. And essential fatty acids can't be synthesized by the animals, but they can be synthesized by plants, so typically we obtain ample quantities of these from our diets. That brings us to vitamins and minerals. Vitamins are organic molecules, and minerals are inorganic molecules, or nutrients. So vitamins can either be water soluble or fat soluble. Water-soluble vitamins would include the C and B vitamins. We can't store them, so if you have an excess of vitamin C or B in your diet, you'll just pee them out. Fat-soluble vitamins would be like A, D, E, and K, and you can store those in your fat tissue, so those vitamins you have to be more careful with if you're taking them as supplements so that you don't overdose on them. Although, I mean, you can overdose on water-soluble vitamins as well. And then not all animals require the same vitamins. For example, primates such as ourselves and guinea pigs can't synthesize their own vitamin C, but other animals can. And then minerals are usually required in pretty small amounts, and if you take too much of a particular mineral, that can impair your health. So if an animal is malnourished, that's because they've had a long-term absent from one or more essential nutrients in their diet. This can cause deformities, disease, and even death. And some animals consume salt or minerals or shells or stones to prevent mineral deficiencies. There's a picture there of a bighorn sheep licking some soil there to consume minerals. And an undernourished individual will typically use up their stored fat and carbohydrates. Then they start to break down their own proteins. When they break down their proteins, they lose muscle mass, and they can have problems with protein deficiency of the brain. And then eventually they either have irreversible damage or they can even die. So if we go to food processing stages, this is relatively straightforward, I think, because we all eat food, so we're kind of aware of this process. So you've got ingestion, where you actually eat the food or feed on it. Then you've got digestion, where nutrients are broken down into smaller molecules in the digestive canal. And then you have absorption, where those smaller molecules, like ions and water, are going to be transported out of the digestive cavity into the body fluids. And then you have egestion or elimination, which is when undigested products are excreted from the animal. And there's a little picture down there of a snake eating a rat that kind of shows you the steps there. So digestion is basically breaking larger food particles into smaller food particles. Mechanical digestion is just going to increase the surface area. It's not chemically changed. So like chewing would be an example of mechanical digestion, where you take your sandwich and chomp it up into smaller sandwich pieces. And then chemical digestion is going to split the large molecules from your sandwich into smaller molecules that can actually pass through your cell membranes. And we use enzymatic hydrolysis for this. If we look at the word hydrolysis, remember hydrolysis, where you use an enzyme and insert a water molecule between H on one side, OH on the other, and that breaks polymers apart. So enzymatic hydrolysis, hopefully you remember talking about that a little bit from 160, and we'll get into more specifics on that coming up here. So then, if we look at how animals do digestion, most animals are going to process their food in specialized compartments, so that way they don't accidentally digest their cells and tissues. So with intracellular digestion, this is when food particles are going to be engulfed by phagocytosis. And remember, phagocytosis is cell eating. So a food vacuole would be taken in, and then it would fuse with a lysosome. Remember, lysosomes are they are a vesicle, and so these two vesicles have fused, and the lysosome contains hydrolytic enzymes. If we look at hydrolytic enzyme, that would just mean an enzyme that does hydrolysis, so an enzyme that does breaking down. So this food vacuole and the lysosome fuse, and then the food is broken down inside of the cell, but inside of a vacuole or a membranous container, so that way the cellular components are safe. Then lots of animals, actually most animals, have extracellular digestion. This is where food particles are broken down not inside of the cells, but outside of the cells, right? Extracellular, outside the cell, in compartments that are going to be continuous with the outside of the animal's body. So there's two big kinds here. You've got the gastrovascular cavity and you've got the alimentary canal. So gastrovascular cavity functions in both digestion and distribution of nutrients, and the alimentary canal, that's what we have, where we have a mouth and an anus, and they're separate things, and we have a tube that connects them. And obviously we're going to go over that in a little bit more detail here. So this picture shows a gastrovascular cavity. Remember, the cnidarians have a gastrovascular cavity, so they have one opening that services both their mouth and their anus. The food goes in, it's digested in that cavity, and the cavity, if you look at the word gastrovascular, right, the gastrovascular cavity breaks down the food and also distributes it throughout the organism. And then the waste is going to leave through that mouth/anus, that one opening. So we've got an alimentary canal. So our alimentary canal goes from our mouth to our pharynx, which is your fancy word for throat, to your esophagus, to your stomach, and then through the small intestine, and then the large intestine, and then out of your body through your anus. We've also got accessory glands like saliva glands, the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, those kinds of things. So let's review on the first image, the first set of images, which one represents a gastrovascular cavity and why. So I know these are not the highest quality images, but it's actually going to be the one on the top right. So that one doesn't have an opening that goes the whole way through. The food goes in and out the same opening. So that's the gastrovascular cavity. Number 2, does a vertebrate have extracellular or intracellular digestion? So, we're a vertebrate. Do we have extracellular or intracellular digestion? Extracellular is outside the cell, intracellular is inside the cell. So, we do digestion outside of our cells in a tube, right? The alimentary canal. So, we have extracellular digestion. Oh, and I gave away number 3. So what kind of digestive system do vertebrates have? We have an alimentary canal. And who has a gastrovascular cavity? That would be like an cnidarian, so a jellyfish. So 3, vertebrates have an alimentary canal. So there's a whole bunch of different ways we can break up this whole digestive system thing. If we look at kind of functional regions, this sort of simplifies it to some degree. When we say a functional region, we mean like how it functions or what its function is. So the anterior end or the beginning of the digestive tract largely is for ingestion and then mechanical digestion, right? So when food goes in your mouth, you're ingesting it and then you're breaking it down with your teeth. So your oral cavity, your salivary glands, your throat, and your esophagus are going to be part of that anterior end. The middle portion is largely for storage and chemical digestion. So the upper part of the small intestine and the associated organs there, like the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, are going to be important for chemical digestion. And then the posterior portion is going to be involved with absorption, although the middle portion does absorption as well. We'll get to kind of more specific regions here, but this just kind of give us an overview. So the posterior portion, absorption and elimination are big roles there. So if we kind of trace the path of food through the organism, in the oral cavity, so in your mouth, your teeth are going to break food into smaller pieces. That's going to be mechanical digestion, right? You're chomping your sandwich into small sandwich bits. Your salivary glands are going to deliver saliva to moisten that. There is a carbohydrate digesting enzyme called salivary amylase, which is going to be the very start of chemical digestion. So this will break down big carbohydrates into smaller carbohydrates, so polysaccharides into di and monosaccharides. And we used to make people do this in lab. That's kind of gross. So if you put a saltine cracker on your tongue and just hold it there until it becomes a soggy mess and don't chew, and you just hold it there, eventually it'll start to taste sweet. But we stopped doing this because it's hard to find saltine crackers that don't have sugar in them already, and it's kind of gross. But I mean, if you're bored now, go ahead, try it, right? We'll wait or hit pause and come back. So that's salivary amylase. And then mucus is also in your saliva as well. Mucus is a viscous mixture. Viscous means it resists flow, which, right, mucus resists flow. It's kind of sticky. And the mucus also has salts and cells and glycoproteins. A glycoprotein is just a carbohydrate, or a protein with a carbohydrate tail is what a glycoprotein is. And then the tongue is going to shape food into what we call a bolus, and that helps you swallow. Then you've got your pharynx, which is your throat. That's the junction that opens to both the esophagus and the trachea. You want your food to go in your esophagus because that makes it go to the stomach, not your trachea because that makes it go to the lungs, and that's a whole mess. So swallowing, I got this first line from a book. I don't remember if it's our book or a different book, but swallowing must be carefully choreographed to avoid choking. I mean, that's pretty accurate. It doesn't seem that complex, but there's a lot going on there. So the esophagus is going to conduct food from the pharynx down to the stomach through a rhythmic cycle of contraction, which is peristalsis. And then there's valves that are called sphincters that regulate the movement of material between compartments. And our book doesn't really go into it, but part of swallowing is voluntary and part of it is involuntary. So that brings us to the stomach. In the stomach, the food and digestive juices are now called chyme. I think on your PowerPoint it's typoed. Autocorrect got me, but it should be CHYME for chyme. And then the stomach secretes gastric juice. Gastric juice has a low pH, so it's acidic. This helps kill bacteria and denature proteins. And this includes hydrochloric acid and pepsin, which is a protease. A protease breaks down proteins into smaller peptides. So still chains of amino acids, just smaller chains of amino acids. The stomach also contracts and relaxes, and that acts as mechanical digestion. And then there's sphincters at the top of the stomach and the bottom, so between the esophagus and the stomach, and between the stomach and the small intestine. And it depends what you eat, like how long that actually stays in the stomach. So I think it's important to note that pepsinogen has to be converted to pepsin, and then hydrochloric acid isn't produced in the cells. The components are secreted individually from the cells. And if you take physiology, you'll probably go into that in a bit more detail. But either way, you don't want hydrochloric acid and you don't want a protease just loose in your cells, because that will cause damage to those cells. So those are activated in the stomach itself, not in the stomach's cells. So we need to protect the stomach from damage. So mucus helps protect the stomach from the damaging gastric juices. Also, the stomach cells divide really rapidly. We get a whole new layer in our stomach every 3 days. However, we can have problems. You can have gastric ulcers in the stomach. People used to say that they were caused just by stress, but now we know that they're mainly caused by a bacterium H. pylori. And there's a picture to the side of the damage to that mucus layer that's done by H. pylori, and then how that can lead to an ulcer. So the small intestine is the longest section of the alimentary canal. So it's small in diameter, not small in length. And this is the major organ of digestion and absorption. And, you know, in an anatomy class, you'll probably get to talk about the small intestine in more detail, but there's different segments in the small intestine. The duodenum is the first section of the small intestine, and it gets content from the pancreas and the liver and the gallbladder and the intestinal wall itself. So the pancreas secretes an alkaline solution. So it's alkaline because it's trying to neutralize the acidic stomach acid. It also has proteases, which again digest proteins. And then the liver produces bile. Bile is important for fat emulsification. And then the gallbladder, if an organism has a gallbladder, the gallbladder stores bile and releases it when it's required. And then the intestinal wall in itself secretes enzymes for hydrolysis, so enzymes to break food down. So in this picture, they've got a picture of the liver with a bile duct from the liver to the gallbladder, and then another bile duct to the small intestine. And you've got your small intestine there. You can see the small intestine gets stuff from the gallbladder and from the pancreas. And it says the pancreas secretes enzymes and bicarbonate ion. Again, those bicarbonate ion will help neutralize the stomach acid there. So the small intestine is important for absorption. It has a large surface area because it has villi and microvilli. So villi are the folds that increase the surface area in the small intestine, and then the microvilli are actually on the cells themselves, where there's little projections. In the picture, they kind of look like cilia, but they're not cilia because they're not for movement. They're just to increase the surface area. And transport across the cell membrane can be either active or passive transport, and probably when you get to hopefully a physiology class, you get to go into more detail on that. You've also got a hepatic portal vein that carries nutrient-rich blood from the capillaries of the villi themselves to the liver and then to the heart. And the liver really regulates nutrient distribution, and it interconverts organic molecules and helps to detoxify many organic molecules as well. So when it comes to lipids, epithelial cells can absorb fatty acids and monoglycerides, and then they can recombine into triglycerides inside of the cell. And then these fats are going to be coated with phospholipids and cholesterol and proteins and form something that is water soluble, which is called a chylomicron. And then chylomicrons are going to be transported into a lacteal, which is part of the lymphatic system, and then delivered to the large veins that return blood to the heart. So we said before that bile is important for emulsification, And with emulsification, that's basically taking a large lipid droplet and breaking it into a smaller lipid droplet there. So in that first picture, the bile salts are kind of green, and then they have that big lipid droplet, and then they're showing them the triglycerides there. And then with an enzyme called lipase, the triglycerides are broken down into fatty acids and monoglycerides. So those fatty acids and monoglycerides can be absorbed into the cell membrane itself, and then they can reform triglycerides in the cell. And then with phospholipids and cholesterols and proteins, that combines with those triglycerides, and you get a chylomicron, which is now water soluble. So that chylomicron can be carried into the lymphatic system and eventually returned back to the blood. So that brings us to the cecum, which is the pouch where the small and large intestine meet, and that helps in fermentation of plant material. Obviously, not all organisms have a well-developed cecum, and if the organism has it, the appendix is going to play a role in immunity. And then the colon is an important part of the large intestine. It helps recover water that has entered the alimentary canal. I do want you to know that the small intestine also helps absorb water. So it's not just the colon that helps absorb water. The small intestine does it as well. I think that sometimes that's a little bit of a confusion, but the colon helps recover water, and then there's bacteria that live in the colon that live on any unabsorbed or undigested organic material, and some of those bacteria help produce vitamins like B12 and K. And then you've got feces that's produced, and that's any undigested material and the bacteria that comes with it. And feces become more solid as they move through the colon. So then feces are stored in the rectum until they can be eliminated through the anus, and there's actually two sphincters between the rectum and the anus that can control bowel movements. So let's review again. Let's trace the path of food through the digestive system. So if you want to pause it and think first, go ahead and do that. So we're going to start with the mouth, and then from the mouth we're going to go into the pharynx, and then from the pharynx you're going to go to the esophagus, and then you're going to go stomach, and you're going to go small intestine and large intestine. And obviously we can make this much more complex if we went through the regions of the small and large intestine, but we're just going to kind of overview it here, so don't get stuck on the details there. Not that they're not important, but we don't have much time, so there you go. Number 5, which accessory digestive organ produces the bile? So is it the gallbladder, the pancreas, or the liver? Who can you throw out right away? Who's not involved with bile at all? So the pancreas, not really involved with bile at all. So your options are now gallbladder or liver. So the gallbladder stores the bile, but the liver actually produces it. So 5 is C, liver. And then 6, where does chemical digestion of proteins begin? That actually starts in the stomach with the proteases there. So that brings us to evolutionary adaptations of the vertebrate digestive systems. So obviously we don't all have exactly the same digestive system, but they're all kind of variations on a common plan, but we have different teeth or dentition, we have differences in our stomach and intestines, and then we have different organisms that live within us that help us along. So we've got different mutualisms. So dentition is your different kinds of assortments of teeth. Mammals have very specialized teeth for different diets, but non-mammalian vertebrates have more or less the same teeth, although some, exceptions exist. Obviously, like a venomous snake's fangs are going to be different than, a non-venomous snake's teeth would be. So then when it comes to stomach and intestinal adaptations, carnivores have large, expandable stomachs, and herbivores and omnivores generally have longer alimentary canals than carnivores, but it takes more time for these animals to digest vegetation, and oftentimes they have specialized mutualisms. So if we look to the left, there's, the stomach and small intestine and the cecum and the colon of a carnivore, and then on the other side we've got a koala. So notice the length of the cecum on the koala, notice the length of the colon on that koala there, so giving lots of space for mutualistic bacteria to help with digestion there. So many herbivores even have fermentation chambers in their alimentary canals where those mutualistic organisms can digest cellulose. I know on our zoo trip, they usually talk about this to some degree. So the most elaborate adaptations for herbivore diets are in the ruminants, which are your cud-chewing animals like deer and sheep and cattle. And you can see that they have multiple stomachs there. So really an animal needs to intake the right amount of food and the right amount of nutrients for like what's happening in its life cycle at that point in time and its needs. So the enteric division of the nervous system helps regulate digestive processes, and then the endocrine system is going to also help regulate digestion through the release and transport of hormones. So in particular, we'll talk about gastrin, CCK, and secretin. So the stomach releases gastrin into the blood in response to a meal, and then gastrin is going to return to the stomach and stimulate muscle contraction and acid production. So that starts the stomach kind of churning. And then the partially digested food, which is now called chyme, is going to move into the small intestine and stimulate the secretion of CCK and secretin. CCK and secretin are going to stimulate the secretion of digestive enzymes and bicarbonate ions from the pancreas into the small intestine. And then CCK is also going to stimulate the contraction of the gallbladder, which releases bile into the small intestine. And that is what CCK is named for. Cholecystokinin means bile sac moving, which is like the gallbladder is the bile sac. So that is where CCK gets its name. So how you use and transfer energy is your bioenergetics, and that determines what kind of nutritional needs you have. And your energy use per unit of time is your metabolic rate. You can track metabolic rate or get a really good estimate of metabolic rate by looking at heat loss or oxygen consumed or CO2 produced. Why would any of those things be related to that? Heat loss, how would heat loss be related to that? Well, when you break down large molecules, right, and produce smaller molecules, you're going to lose heat. What about oxygen consumption? Where do we use oxygen that has anything to do with metabolism? So in the electron transport chain, right? Remember that? Cellular respiration, oxygen is our final electron acceptor. So when we make ATP, we use oxygen. And then CO2 produced, well, when we make ATP, we produce CO2. If you remember the citric acid cycle and if you want to call it the PrEP step or the pyruvate oxidation, those both produce carbon dioxide. So measuring any of those things gives us an idea of metabolic rate. So when it comes to your minimum metabolic rate, an endotherm and ectotherm are going to have a different minimum metabolic rate. Remember, endotherms rely on breaking down their food in order to maintain their body temperature, and an ectotherm largely has behavioral adaptations to maintain their body temperature. So the minimum metabolic rate of a non-growing endotherm at rest with an empty stomach and it's not experiencing stress is called the basal metabolic rate. If you're an ectotherm, your metabolic rate, if you're fasting and non-stressed, is called your standard metabolic rate. And then endothermy is going to be more energetically costly than ectothermy because, again, an endotherm has to maintain their body temperature by breaking down their food. And then if you're more active, that's also going to affect your metabolic rate because if you're more active, you need more ATP, so you need more nutrients, etc., etc. So when you consume more energy than you need for metabolism, that excess energy is going to be stored. In humans, the liver and the muscle cells are going to be used first, and we're going to store that energy as glycogen. And then when those glycogen stores are full, we're going to store it as fat in adipose cells. And then if we are in kind of an energy debt time where we have fewer calories that are taken in than expended or used, the body is going to use the liver glycogen, then the muscle glycogen, and then fat. So here's the picture of maintaining glucose homeostasis. So if we start off on the top, you've got blood glucose levels rising after eating. That causes insulin to be released. That causes body cells to take in glucose, and it causes the liver to store glucose as glycogen, and that lowers the blood glucose levels. When your blood glucose levels dip too low, that causes the body to release glucagon from the alpha cells of the pancreas. That causes the release of the breakdown of glycogen and the release of glucose, and that causes the blood glucose levels to rise again. So sometimes there's challenges in maintaining blood glucose levels. So you've probably heard of diabetes before. So diabetes mellitus is in a way a deficiency of insulin or a decreased response to insulin target tissues. And our book still calls them type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, but other places you've maybe heard of like insulin dependent diabetes, things like that before. But I'm just going with what our book is going with. So if you've heard other terms before, they're not necessarily wrong, depending on where you heard them from, obviously. But anyhow, type 1 diabetes is basically an autoimmune disorder in which the immune system destroys the pancreatic beta cells, and so you are not able to release insulin when it's required. So that would be insulin dependent. Type 2 diabetes is typically characterized by a failure of the target cells to respond normally to insulin. So if your cells don't respond to the signal, they won't take in the sugar, and so your blood glucose levels will still remain high. Heredity and excess body weight and lack of exercise are typical factors in type 2 diabetes there. So no matter what, your cells are unable to take up glucose to meet their metabolic needs, and so fat becomes the main substrate for cellular respiration. So overnourishment can also cause problems. Like, it's pretty obvious undernourishment causes problems, and overnourishment can cause problems as well, like obesity. So if we have an excess intake of food energy and that excess is stored as fat, that can lead to problems. So researchers have discovered there's several mechanisms that help to regulate body weight. You've got ghrelin, which is a hormone secreted by the stomach walls, and that triggers the feeling of hunger before meals. You've also got insulin and PYY, which are hormones secreted by the small intestine that are supposed to help suppress appetite. And you've got leptin, which is a hormone produced by the fat tissue or adipose tissue that also suppresses appetite and may help regulate body fat levels. All right, so let's review. You might need to take a second, so feel free to pause if you want, and then I'll just go ahead and answer. So number 7, if we look at number 7, it says increases blood sugar. The two that had to do with blood sugar were insulin and glucagon. So it's actually going to be glucagon. This is cheesy, but I always think glucagon comes out when glucose is gone to help you increase the blood sugar levels. So then number 8, insulin is going to lower blood sugar levels. So 7 should be A and 8 is D. And then who triggers the feeling of hunger? So that should be ghrelin. This is silly, but I think like when your stomach ghrelin, right? I don't know. If that's a terrible memory trick, you find your own, right? 10 then stimulates stomach muscle contraction and acid production. That one's going to be gastrin. So C is what 10 is. And then 11, stimulate the secretion of digestion enzymes and bicarbonate ion from the pancreas into the small intestine. That's going to be CCK and secretin. All right, that's it. We made it through chapter 33. So we talked about feeding and nutrients and food processing. I think feeding and food processing are relatively straightforward. Nutrients, I think, are also relatively straightforward. We talked about gastrovascular cavity and alimentary canal. Remember, gastrovascular cavity, one opening. So like an Idarian has a gastrovascular cavity, and then we have an alimentary canal where we have two separate openings. Mechanical and chemical digestion. Digestion in general is breaking big particles into small particles. Mechanical is like chewing, where the chemicals themselves are not changed. Chemical would be like requiring an enzyme, so going from a protein to a smaller peptide. We trace the path of food through the alimentary canal. So on this, we're kind of going big picture, so don't worry about the parts of the small intestine or the parts of the large intestine, but just keep that pretty general. We talked about accessory digestive organs, so those are the organs that are not part of the tubes themselves, but connect into them, so like liver, pancreas, gallbladder, that sort of thing. And then we talked about the hormones involved in regulating digestion. So that's it, and I will talk to you when you get to the next chapter. Have a good one.